Just kind of setting the stage. So first off, I'm Taylor Brown. I'm a lead program manager on the Windows Server team. And my job is to get you all to love Windows Server as a developer, to want to use Windows Server in your development environment, to love using Windows Server. That's my job. And I'm actually really excited that that is my job. I'm excited that that's something I get to focus on and that I get to work with you all on over the next couple of years. My background is, as I was saying, I came from test. I've worked in test for years. I've been a program manager for the last 5 years. I did all of our container work. So I got to work with Docker and bring containers to Windows Server. That's something my team continues to focus on. That's part of our application and developer story. But now we're getting to broaden that out and talk more about other types of techniques we're going to use. So as I kind of think about and talk to people, one of the things I'm finding is that developers end up spending most of their time doing a couple things: debugging an existing application, fixing an existing application, adding features to an existing application, fixing the feature someone else added to the application, and then maybe if there's a little time left over, they actually get to build something new. Does that resonate? Yeah? Everybody hates it because you all want to be spending the time on the last thing, building something new.
Let's work on the old stuff.
Yeah. And when I talk to application admins, IT pros, people who are deploying stuff, they kind of say the same thing. They spend their time maintaining the existing apps, redeploying the existing app, which is usually pretty painful, diagnosing an issue with the existing app, troubleshooting an issue that someone caused when they added a feature, or because there's different versions of it lying around, or different problems with it. And then maybe if they get some time, they actually get to think about deploying a new application. And for them, usually what it means is that they don't actually get enough time to think about that last step. They just get an application dropped on them, and they got to figure it out, right? The reality that we face is that we can't throw away every old app. I talk to customers who have 2,000 or 3,000 applications that they manage. You just can't throw it away. And it's stuff like the payroll app. People get pretty mad if you don't get paid. The time and absence reporting app. Like our time and absence reporting app at Microsoft for vacations is like circa 2000. The thing is like way old. But it works. I could take vacation. I get to go to Peru next week. Pretty excited about that. We can't stop adding features to the app either. People are going to ask for stuff. Got to figure out how to add it in. We can't stop maintaining the app. We can't just let it sit there and rot. We could try, but eventually it'll break and we'll have to go fix it. But we can make it a lot easier to deal with all of these things. And we can use new tools and code as we develop these new applications. So the paradigm that we're going to talk about today is stopping writing old code in the old app and starting to write new code as new pieces that are connected to that app, right? So over time, we get away from that monolith, we break that up, and we start writing new code. So when we think about how to actually start through this is a pattern that we're seeing a lot of success with right now. People are taking their existing applications, they're containerizing them, which gives them the ability to move them around, to redeploy them reliably, and get some efficiency out of them. And the redeployment's the big part. If you know you can redeploy it easily and go backward and forward, you've got a lot more flexibility. I can take some risk now. I can add a new piece to that application, and if it breaks, I can roll it back quickly and not have to worry about redeploying it or figuring out how to fix it in production, right? Then we can start to transform that app from a monolithic application or a big collection of old code, and I can start to break it up into smaller pieces. I can start to make microservices out of it. I can start to use the new design paradigms. And then as I build new applications, I can use new agile cloud development models for doing that. And we're going to go through some examples of all of these as we move forward. Right? Now this pattern works. So we've seen Tyco's talked about their path through this. So they started by lifting and shifting the application, moving it from an older version of Windows Server, moving it into containers and starting to break it up. Right? We've seen Northern Trust do the same thing. So they gained 4 times faster deployment times and half of the infrastructure. So they were able to double up their infrastructure utilization and improve their deployment time. Even Microsoft IT, they've actually done about 20 apps now, and they've got 4 times the app density without any degradation to performance and at 2/3 reduction in infrastructure cost. Right? So these are the things that sell the CTO or the CIO or whoever on why we're doing it. But the reality comes down to we can actually redeploy things faster, we can start to make changes to it. And then this week, Alaska Airlines talked about their journey through this as well, moving all of their application into containers, putting it on Service Fabric, and being able to deploy that. So I didn't actually even know that earlier this year they had moved all the way over to containers. So when I booked my flight a couple weeks ago, I was using containers. It's kind of cool to find out. So this pattern really does work, right? This is a pattern that we've seen success with, and there's a lot of other customers we can talk about as well. But let's kind of dig into what this actually looks like. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a couple techniques for containerizing an existing application, taking that existing code and moving it into a container. So the first way we're going to talk about that is through Visual Studio. And rather than run through a whole slide of stuff, let's jump over to Steve and go through a demo of it.
So hi, so I'm Steve Lasker. I'm a program manager on our Visual Studio, well, not just Visual Studio, but on our container tooling. As Taylor talked about, loves Windows and getting people working there. I work on getting developers into containers, helping them to build those out, and hopefully get them running in Azure. So one of the things that we are focused on is making sure you can take your existing apps, containerize them for that modern workflow, so it's easier to maintain, easier to get updates to the apps that's deployed, because even OS updates are going to come through the app pipeline as well. So here we have an app, just a web app, and what we wanted to do was really kind of bridge the ability to do the experiences that you're used to in Visual Studio with the truity of working with Docker and its command lines. So when I say add Docker support, what we'll do, well, first of all, when I'm choosing with .NET Core, I have a choice of Windows or Linux. So that's also some options that I have here. We'll grab Windows here. And by doing that, what we're doing is we're adding the Docker file to the project that will associate with the project type that I have. So here, this happens to be an ASP.NET Core. Notice we say Nano Server, and we brought in just a standard Docker file that we've set up for you. And Docker files are used to build images, right? It's part of the source code to build it. And then when I instance it, we need an additional file, or we can use an additional file with Docker Compose to say when I run this image, what are the parameters that I want? And we'll see that evolve here in a moment. So what I can do now is, just as you would expect in Visual Studio, I hit F5, and we'll start doing our build. We're going to build the code that we would normally do in Visual Studio, but we're also going to build an image. And if we just sit here and take a look at, I just didn't mean to do that. Docker images, we can see I've got the .NET image if I was doing a console app, an ASP.NET if I'm doing something like 4.6.2 with IIS and Windows Server, or in this case where I'm using ASP.NET Core. So the first time what we're doing is we're actually building that image, right? We've got to actually take our source, set it up, and we'll see that pop up here in a second. So if I say Docker PS, we'll see that starting to come up. And now, as I'm running this, it is the app, excuse me, just as I would, the same experience you would get if you're working locally, except I'm now running in a container. And we also support the ability to make changes on your content. So if I went into the home page and the about page rather, and say, hey, it's Friday, woohoo. And I come over here, and we can see that I've already got that right in there. And that's what you're used to doing with IIS Express running locally, right? Because IIS Express is just running against your local code. But now I'm running in a container. I'm running in a whole nother operating system or an instance of that and another machine on my laptop. And what we're doing is we're establishing a volume share that you can actually make those changes and be iterative about it. But as we talk about this, the thing that we want to also be able to do is kind of scale this out. Right? Taylor was talking about I have new code that I want to write. So what if I wanted to say add an API? So I'll choose here and we'll just do an API project. And so now imagine, just for the sake of the demo here, imagine the other one, some code that you've been working on for years, and now instead of working in that other code, I can just add a new functionality. And what I can do now is just right-click and say add Docker support, and we'll be able to add that ability to this particular project, because for each one, we need to be able to do that. So we'll say add Docker support for this project. And what we'll also see is our compose file gets merged, because now we're looking at the solution and we're saying, oh, actually you have multiple projects here. You probably want them to run together. In fact, if you notice, the Docker Compose project is our startup project, and that's how we've got that here. Now, it's an API. Unless there's something to actually interact with, it's not all that interesting. So let me come over here, and we'll drop some content in here just to kind of do the, I always forget, Julia Child, right? Or I don't know, who's pulling things out of the oven these days?
Martha Stewart, Trisha Yearwood, I don't know.
I don't know.
My wife watches the cooking shows. I'm not so much.
Does she make good meals?
She does.
All right, so
Yeah.
something to it.
Yeah.
All right, so I've dropped some stuff in there, and let's just rebuild this again, and we'll see those pages. And I just dropped in some controllers to make it interesting. So now what it's going to do is build that image for the API as well. So if we look here, we'll see that it's starting to build that API image as well, and it's a dev image. One of the things that we're doing is, because we're volume mounting our code into it, we don't actually need to copy the code. So we're just kind of letting you know that that dev tag is a specialized version of the image. It's the same Docker file, it's just we're volume mounting the code into it instead. So we'll let that finish up, and we'll kick that in. And let's see, now you can also do a release build, and if you do the release build, that's where we will put the images in there as well. And of course you can do this from a command line as well. Now, let's see, what else did I want to cover there? I guess that's it. So I'll finish it up, we'll get that first image built. And now, as you'll notice I've got an extra page on here that calls in. But what I can do is I just go to the controller here, and I can set a breakpoint, just like I said, as I would expect. We'll come over here, and we'll set a breakpoint in our API as well. Actually, it's not there, here. And now, the magic of the 8-ball is doesn't really matter what you ask it. It's just going to give you an answer, so I don't need to actually type anything in there. So now I'm in I'm in one server, the web container, and I've got my breakpoints in there. And I can, of course, do all the step over and so forth. And if I hit continue, notice my selection is now in the API controller. And I can get all the answers that I expect from there. Let's see where our random is. It's 4. It's fine. And now I've got my page reloaded. So now imagine you're actually testing completely different services now, whether it be Windows Server, Core for a .NET Framework app, or .NET Core, or you might want to have a new one that's written in .NET Core 2. And you don't have to worry about all these things working side by side, because each of them are in their own container, their completely own environment. And then I can just use service discovery of the orchestrators to connect them together. And we've done that with Docker Compose here to stitch those together. So that's just an example of that.
All right. Thanks, Steve. So the other tool that I'll talk about as another way to go about this is a tool set called Image to Docker. Image to Docker is a project that was started by Docker, and I've got some pointers in the next slide to where to get it. But what Image to Docker is really good at is taking code from an existing machine. So I've got my nice old machine.
Are you trying to say something here that you must be really old or something?
It could be. We've actually got customers doing this against Windows 2003. So they take their 2003, they run this PowerShell command that convert to Docker file, point at the server, give it an output file, and what artifact they're looking for. So in this case, I've said IIS. So I'm saying, hey, go scavenge that machine, find me all of the IIS instances, the web apps on there, and make me a Docker file for it. And what that'll output is something akin to this. So it's a Docker file. It's the instructions to build a container image for that server. Right? And so it says from Microsoft ASP.NET, it's using Server Core, because typically we're going to be looking for compatibility with these old machines. We're going to be looking for things that'll run from an older version. It's using PowerShell to remove the default website and to add in this new IIS environment on port 8090, because it figured that out from looking at the server that it was looking at, and exposing that port out, right? And what we found with this tool is that it's pretty darn good. About 80% of the content can just move across right away.
How many of you know what's configured on the server that's running that app for a while? I mean, this is the nice way to just pull those configurations back out so you can now control it in your source control of your app.
And this is all, it's non-destructive. So I can point it at that server, I can run it, I can build that container image, I can try it out. If it works, party on, we're in production, we can go forward. If it doesn't, I can kind of figure out what's missing there and poke at it a little bit and add a few more things to the Docker file and get it up and running the rest of the way, right? So this is an open source PowerShell module, which means as you find things that you'd like to add to it, please do. It works against WIM files, VHD files, VHDX files, or live servers. Right, so it supports all of those different types already. The things that it can look for, it can look at roles and features. So it can go look at what roles and features are installed. It can also look at what installed programs are present. So it goes and looks at add remove programs effectively and says, hey, what's there? What it really shines at is IIS, so it can handle HTTP handlers, it can handle IIS websites, file system paths, ASP.NET applications. It can also handle SQL Server instances and Apache Web Server. These are the things that it knows how to do today. As I said before, it's open source, so if you want to add something else to it, please do. And here's a couple pointers to it. So it's on the PowerShell gallery. It's also on GitHub. So GitHub Docker, community tools, image to Docker. Right? If you don't feel like adding something, you've got a suggestion, go ahead and open an issue. So Docker's been adding more and more resources to this project. Some of our other partners as well. So we launched a program at DockerCon called the MTA program, Modernized Traditional Application Program. It's a consulting program that we're using to help accelerate customers through this migration period. You go to docker.com/MTA if you want to find out more about it. But they're adding stuff to this project as well. So as they're finding additional places where this is necessary, they're adding things as well. So this is two different ways that we can go about containerizing an existing application. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about as we start to move that forward, as we're moving that monolith to a microservice. And the first important part of that is orchestration. So Steve already kind of showed you this. We go from one container, we could end up with two containers. So we start to split things up. Now we've got two. Pretty quickly, we've got in containers. We've got many different ones. And as soon as we've got more than one, we really need something to help us orchestrate them, something to help us manage those and deploy those and update them consistently. So we've got a couple different options for orchestration. And I'm going to go through the three that are really well supported for Windows Server. So the first one I'll talk about is Docker Enterprise Edition, or Docker Data Center. So Docker Data Center is a management tool set on top of Docker. So it manages what they call swarms. Swarms are a collection of servers that are kind of stitched together to look like one big server.
They got some really cool names.
Yeah, they do. And they've got some great art, too. I like their icons. So this has got beta support for Windows Server containers and Hyper-V isolation today. It will be GA in June. So by the time you get back and do a POC, it's going to be GA. They're marching ahead very quickly with it. It's got a really easy deployment experience. All of the actual code is containerized itself. So the actual UI and everything just runs as containers. They've got a really nice UI around it. You take that compose file that Steve showed in Visual Studio, you just upload it into Docker Data Center, and away you go. Full web management portal, role-based and Active Directory access controls. So you can go in and set all the different access control policies and roles and responsibilities. They always do a really nice little demo during DockerCon where they've got the business guy who comes around and wants to help out with stuff. And he's got the permissions to not do much. So you can set that up for your business guy who doesn't do much.
What are you trying to say, Taylor?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of the business guy.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And then self-healing and rolling app upgrades and deployments. The other one that we talked about, and image scanning. The other one we talked about a bunch this week is Service Fabric. So Service Fabric now is GA for Windows Server Container and Hyper-V isolation. So you can use that in production, supported in Azure. It's going to be coming to on-prem in about a month. Image deployment and activation, so you can upload your container images right into it. It will do all the deployment and management of them. They're working on improving even volume driver support. They've got some basic volume driver support already. We'll talk a little bit about volume drivers in a moment here. They've got networking and DNS discovery, so you can give your containers DNS addresses and names and do discovery across them. And they support resource governance as well. So you can set caps and memory reserves and all sorts of stuff on there. And for all of these, this is kind of an abridged list of their capabilities. It would be mini slides to go through all of it. And then Kubernetes is the other one that I'll talk about. So they've got alpha support for Windows Server containers now. They actually demonstrated another variation of this at Red Hat at OpenShift last week. So they showed OpenShift version of Kubernetes managing Windows Server, which was awesome to see. It's a weird world that I live in now where I'm like, yeah, Red Hat's supporting Windows Server. But
It's very
I love
confusing.
it. The control plane runs on the Linux nodes. So you have some Linux nodes that are actually running kind of the control plane, the UI, the management framework. And then what they call the kubelet, which is the thing that actually runs containers, runs on the actual Windows nodes. All the networking is done through L3 routing. And currently, we have a limitation of 1 container per pod. Kubernetes has this notion of a pod, which is kind of a collection of containers that can be linked together. And in Linux, they can run multiple containers per pod, and they can share an IP address and network interface and things. Currently, we have a limitation of 1 per pod, but keep that in mind in a few minutes. And then here's a quick little pointer to their docs on how to get started. The easiest way to get started with Kubernetes on Windows is to use ACS. Go to the Azure Container Service. Azure Container Service.
Okay.
And so the Azure Container Service will give you an instance of Kubernetes or an instance of Docker Swarm that's all pre-configured and kind of ready to go. And it's all open source as well, so you can actually go inspect that and look at how they built it. We were talking to one customer this week who was saying the way they got Kubernetes running on-prem, they went and stood up an instance of ACS, the Azure Container Service, with Kubernetes. They took the binaries off, copied them down, and ran it locally. Works for me. That's what we built it for. So now that we've talked a little bit about that part of it, I'm going to talk about how we can start doing some of our new application development. So we're starting to see that containers are showing up and popping up everywhere. They're all over Azure, so we can use them in the Azure Container Service. We can use them in Service Fabric. And then this
App
week,
services.
Yeah, app services. And then this week we talked about functions. And there was something that kind of got missed as we went through the functions discussion. We brought functions on-prem. This was a new announcement that kind of didn't hit in the keynote as well as I'd hoped it would. So what this allows us to do is actually take the existing Azure functions that we have in Azure and bring them on-prem. So it's the exact same programming model, the exact same portal, the exact same Visual Studio publishing experience. It's fully Azure consistent, but it now supports running on your local environment. Completely disconnected from Azure. You don't have to have any Azure connection at all. Just download the 2 MSIs, install one on one server, install as many controllers as you want, and your functions will run. Yeah?
All right. You never know what'll get applause.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So it supports timer triggers, it supports file system and SQL service triggers today, and all of the functions run inside of a container. So I think this is just pretty cool. I got to show it.
I mean, it's just cool. It's just a lot of stuff is just easier for us to manage as well as running our platforms. And we talk to retailers, run these point-of-sale systems. And how do you deploy code? Right? We've done a lot of tools around MSIs and automating that. With containers, you just run it and you throw away the other one. Just so simple.
So this is a Windows Server 2016 machine, stock machine running in Azure. You can see it's going to Taylor B function demo 1. And we've got the Azure Functions UI. This is the exact same UI that you would see in Azure, right? So I can do all the view files. I can create functions. So I've actually had this timer function running since yesterday. We can actually see it's run 679 times. So it just runs every couple seconds. And if I actually go look at this machine and I say Docker PS, and let me bump the font on this guy. Sorry about that. Things I usually do beforehand. All right. So if we actually look at Docker PS, we can see it's actually running a functions container. So every A couple seconds, it runs a new one. And if I do Docker images, there it is. There's the functions container that's running that. Now, if I go over and say, all right, cool, let's build another function. So we'll say hello build, create that guy. So for people who have used functions, this is the exact same UI and experience. So now I've got a function collection. We'll build a new trigger. We will name it. I'll just leave it that name. Why not? So there we go. We've created another function. So it's just doing its normal little login thing. And that is now provisioning a container. You can see it right here. It says provisioning container hello build 0. If we go look at Docker PS, let's do this. Where's down Dockers? There we go. Docker PS. So now we've got 2 containers running. So these are all just running in the background. Now what's really cool is I can actually make those functions. If I had installed the client role on a Windows 10 machine, they'd be running on that too. So now I can use all of those extra resources that I have sitting around to run functions for me, right? Try to do that with Lambda.
I mean, it's pretty powerful how we can bridge the
Yeah.
cloud and on-prem, right? There's a lot of
Yeah, there's a ton of value there. And this is in preview. So this is stuff, you can go grab the code today, start playing with it. What we really need is feedback on it, right? It's got a limited set of capabilities today. We know there's some things that we want to finish up, but we also don't know what else we should be adding to it. And what priority to put those on. So please, 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 there's some pointers at the end. Send me mail, send the Azure Functions team mail, give us feedback on our user voice page. What are the things you'd like to see in that? How can that be more efficient for your environment? We're really committed to continuing that work, right? So that's all available today. But when we started this session, we said we're going to talk about today, and we're going to talk about what we're doing tomorrow, right?
literally tomorrow.
So, well, literally like we've been doing it already. So the first part of that is we're working on the next version of Windows Server already. We have been. It will be shipping this fall. We will have the next version of Windows Server 6 months, well, about a year after the last version of Server shipped. Compare that to before, we had about a 3-year cycle. So we are getting much, much faster. So the first thing, we've already shown this once before. We showed it at DockerCon. We are bringing Linux containers to Windows Server. So you will be able to run Linux containers natively on Windows Server. And the way we're doing that is through our Hyper-V isolation technology. So we built Hyper-V isolation originally to run Windows Server containers in isolation. So we could run them inside of a virtual machine and have the same security boundaries, the same isolation properties that we had of a virtual machine. But it also allowed us to have a different kernel. And that became really handy when we decided we wanted to run Linux containers. So now we can run Linux containers natively using that same technology. We have a single Docker engine that can support both. We have a single container host that can support both. So now we can really run any container, regardless of the OS it was built on, and with your choice of Linux kernels. And yes, this will also be coming to Windows 10 this summer as well. Yeah.
That's just pretty cool, right? It's like no longer these big divides between
things.
companies. That's like, you're the Linux side, you're the Windows side, and no shall they meet in the middle, right? It's a pretty powerful way to pull us together.
So I got to show a demo of this too, because it's another one that I just think is too cool.
Too good not to show.
So we are in a Windows Server Core machine in Azure. So this is a machine that we set up ahead of time. And I'm going to do one thing first. I'm going to start another shell real quick. I'll get back to why I did that in a moment. So all I have to do now is I can say Docker images, so I can look at my images. I've got BusyBox.
Want to bump your font up?
Oh, yeah. This is what happens when you finish your slides and your demo is like midnight last night. All right, there we go. So for those of you who don't know what BusyBox is a Linux image. It's got Linux tools, it runs a Linux kernel, it depends on Linux. That's what it does. So now I can just say Docker run, just like I normally would, and I'll pass the isolation flag. So I'm going to run it in Hyper-V mode, BusyBox, and sh for the BusyBox shell. So what this is doing now is it's starting up this lightweight virtual machine that we've built. And this is early code, so it takes a little longer than it will when we get to production. And then it's running that BusyBox image inside of that. So now we are in a Linux container running on Windows Server all through our Hyper-V isolation technology. So I've got bin, so I can do cd bin, right? I can do ls in there. If I try to do dir, it's going to tell me no, because that's not. You're not in Windows
Just
anymore.
very confused.
I know. So if I do like CLS, no, but I can do clear, oops, and get up to the top. So it is running an exact copy of BusyBox. And if I go back to our PowerShell window that I opened a minute ago, let me bump the font on this guy first. I can say get compute process. This is a command that we actually added before that allows us to see all of the either VMs or containers that are running on a server. It's been there all along. We can actually see I'm running this runtime image called Linux kernel. It is a container with Hyper-V, right? I can even do a dir on that guy. Oops. And just bump that up to the top. So there's the two pieces that we're actually running from that Linux image, an initRD and a boot x64 EFI. That's our representation of Linux that we're running inside of that, that container, right? Pretty cool. But there's more.
Wait,
There's more.
For 1995.
I had some fun with PowerPoint. Yeah. We are also bringing Bash, or the Windows subsystem for Linux, to server now as well, right? So this is really what is going to allow us to manage and debug and deploy and do all of those Linux native things when we're working with Linux containers on Windows Server using Linux tools. So now if I've got a bash script that builds my containers, or a bash script that launches my containers, or a bash script that debugs those containers, I can use that on the host, and I can use our Linux isolation technology to run the containers in production. It's really a great marriage of the two technologies. So I can bring those same scripts from Linux, I can bring the same scripts I'm using in Mac, or from Windows 10, and now run them on Windows Server. Right? It's the exact same experience, the exact same features that we have on Windows 10, because it's the exact same code. And what that means is that we've got great support from Canonical. Right? So we'll be able to run Ubuntu on server through WSL. As we announced in the keynote yesterday, we'll be able to run SUSE, so you can choose. And we're working with Fedora as well to bring all three options to Windows Server. And those will complement all of the different Linux kernels you can run. So we've already got support for Ubuntu, for Clear, for Red Hat, for SUSE, and for Linux Kit from Docker. So 4 different kernels to choose from, 3 different ways to run the Windows subsystem for Linux on Windows Server. I'm going to take questions at the end because we're a little short on time for everything, right? So awesome feature. I'm really glad that we can bring this around. We're also bringing the Windows Server Insider program, or the Windows Insider program, to Windows Server. So this will provide frequent and regular builds of Windows Server to anyone in the world. It's going to be aligned with the Windows 10 flights, which means about once a week, there'll be a new version of Windows Server for you to download and play with. We're going to be adding a new server category in the Feedback Hub. So if you open the Feedback Hub on Windows 10, there will be a server category. You can give us feedback right through that Feedback app. When you give us feedback in the Feedback app, that flows directly into our bug database. So as you give us bug reports and issue requests and things that you'd like to see, those get directly turned into bugs against our engineering team, against our PM team to go work on. And so it's the fastest path to giving us feedback. And we end up in feedback jail. So if we actually don't triage our feedback often enough, they lock us in jail and make us work on feedback until we get out of jail. So if you put a bunch of stuff in there, no matter what, we will end up looking at it. Now the reality is, I want
you
the
just tell them how
feedback.
to slow you down, just like open a lot of bugs?
Yeah, if you're not happy with what we're building, put a bunch of feedback in there and we'll look
No
at
new
it.
features, just do bugs.
We're also adding new channels to the tech communities. So how many people are a part of the tech community? Not very many. So techcommunity.microsoft.com it's a new page we launched at Ignite last year, new portal. So it's kind of like a nice forum system. But we're going to be adding new channels into that as well. So you'll be able to download ISOs from the Insider portal, and you'll be able to pull new container images from the Docker Hub. And again, this will be launching this summer, so stay tuned. Sometime June, July-ish, we'll be starting to post builds up there. And then the goal is to align with the Windows 10 flight. So every week, we'll be putting new builds of Windows Server out there. What I really need from all of you is to grab those builds, pull them down, give us feedback on them, let us know what you like, let us know what you don't like. Your feedback will really drive the development of Windows Server. So the next thing we're doing, I know, I just keep going.
NanoMan.
NanoMan. We are optimizing Nano Server as a container image. Now, we're also optimizing Server Core. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But we're really focusing a ton of energy on Nano Server. So with Windows Server 2016, the uncompressed Nano container image was about a gig. Not very nano. It had a bunch of components that were just really not relevant for containers. So if you open it up and looked at what was in there, we still had a lot of stuff that was really relevant for a physical machine. It was relevant for a VM, but it wasn't really relevant for a container, like the recovery shell, right? And some of that was just the artifact of our engineering system. We had a hard time separating the way that those things worked, but we're working on that. None of the optional components were layers. They were just part of the actual OS, so we couldn't pull them down in a container-native way. So the first set of things we're doing in this feature release, and then continuing forward, we're significantly reducing the size on disk. So we've already committed to 50% reduction in size. Conservatively, that's 50%. I think we're actually going to exceed that even in this first release. And we're really committed to continuing down that road. So both the pull size, the compressed size, and the on-disk size will get much, much smaller. Now, we're doing that by removing a bunch of components that are not relevant to containers. And this is one of the areas that I need the most feedback on. We're gutting the contents of it. We're pulling out WMI, we pulled out IIS, we pulled out .NET, we pulled out PowerShell, we pulled out every driver, we pulled out event loggers, we pulled out scheduled tasks. Like, we're going to town. It will break stuff. I need your help to tell us when we broke stuff. Because the vision on this and the message to the team is we got to get aggressive. Let's cut and trim and get this thing to be as optimized as possible. And when we find things that we missed, we'll add them back in, we'll bring them back. But let's not be afraid. Let's move forward fast and make this thing small. We're also going to be delivering all the optional components as layers now. So you'll pull down Nano Server, and if you want .NET, you'll pull down .NET as a layer on top of that. If you want PowerShell, you'll pull down PowerShell as a layer on that. If you don't want PowerShell, you don't have to have PowerShell. You don't want .NET, you don't have to have .NET. Right? So these are all going to be optional layers now, very native to the container experience. Right? All right, next big thing. Just keep going. We're doing a bunch of extra platform plumbing for the container orchestrators. So what does that mean? Well, we actually already shipped network overlay support. So we shipped this as an update to Windows Server 2016 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago at DockerCon. So what this allows us to do is to make native networks, bridge networks, across Swarm clusters. So without having to configure any special networking or do anything magical, we can make basically sub-virtual networks on top of the existing fabric. Really cool technology, great feature. So that's already available. You download the latest Windows update, you got it. We're adding the ability to map name pipes into containers. Now, this seems like a little bit of an ancillary feature, but what this allows the orchestrator to do is to connect as a container image to connect back to the host that it's managing. So now we can have our orchestrators run as container images on Windows Server. The cool thing about this is we're bringing it to both Windows Server containers, which is our shared kernel container, as well as Hyper-V isolation containers. So we figured out how to do it for both in a secure and manageable way. We're adding the ability to do hot out of network interfaces. This was incredibly important for Kubernetes. So Kubernetes, the model that they use when they start a container is they start the container with no network adapter, and then they add the network adapter second. We didn't currently support that, so it made it very difficult for them to orchestrate our containers. So we're really happy to be adding that. And then the last one is we're doing the initial support for sharing network interfaces between containers. So when I talked about Kubernetes and pods earlier on and said they don't really have support for multiple containers per pod, this is why. So we're bringing the initial support for that. And when I say initial support, we can bring it for the shared kernel containers in this first feature release, it's going to take us another release to get Hyper-V isolation added as well. And our commitment around those is that they maintain the same. So we're calling it initial support because it doesn't have support for both. But this will enable the Kubernetes community to move forward and give us feedback on the interfaces and the way that we're doing that so that we can bring that to Hyper-V isolation in the short period as well. So that's what we're doing for container orchestrators. We're also doing a bunch of work for mapping volumes. So today I can do something like docker run -v d:/path c:/container path. And what that actually is going to do is it's going to map a folder from my container host into the container. So now anything I write to c:/container path is going to actually show up on the host at d:/path. Great for SQL databases, great for logs, great for a number of things, right? What we're adding to this is the ability to do the same thing with file servers. So now I can say, I would like to map whack file server whack share someplace to my container. So now as my containers move around, I can still bring that across.
So you're no longer pinned to a specific host anymore.
Right.
So that's pretty cool. Yeah, I'll give you a clap on that one too.
Yeah. This is also going to enable a whole bunch of volume plugins. This feature and the name pipes are going to bring a bunch of additional volume drivers to the ecosystem for us. Right? So really, really great and exciting to be able to bring that around. We've also got a bunch of other little things. So we've got a bunch of polish, bug fixes. A lot of these were driven by your feedback. So as people gave us feedback and said, hey, this is a problem, a lot of those came through the GitHub issues that we have either for our documentation page or from Docker or from forums. We've been addressing those one by one and trying to improve them. Performance and density is going to continue to improve. So we're shaving off startup time and throughput. I give you numbers on it, but we're still early in the development process. So some of the gains we had, bugs may come in that we may lose a little of that. We may gain it in other places. But we're continuing to improve startup time, throughput, density, all of the core fundamentals. And then I talked a little bit about optimizing the container images. So we talked about what we're doing for Nano and really aligning that with .NET Standard 2.0 and bringing a great Nano experience. We're also optimizing server core. So we are removing stuff and optimizing the server core image. The server core image is always going to be bigger. It's always going to be a larger image because its goal, its life's mission is to be the compatibility image so that all of your existing code can move onto that image and run reliably. And as soon as I remove stuff from it, I'm going to break stuff, and I'm going to break more and more, and we're going to lose that ability to say, hey, that code that's running on 2003 got a pretty good chance of running on server core, right? So we want to keep that image as our compatibility base, and then innovate on Nano Server. Make that the small, light, fast image that we can build new code against, right?
I mean, if you think about it today, you might run multiple websites in a single IIS instance. And then you might run a Windows service or a scheduled task all on that same VM. The idea is with containers is each container is its own process. So you can actually start splitting those things up, managing them independently, not worrying about this fragility. You change one thing and everything else kind of topples. You get complete isolation. So that's really nice when you start breaking these things up.
Yeah. So I expect we'll probably be able to shave at least 500 meg, probably more like a gig, maybe even a little more off of the server core image, just by doing some deduplication and some maintenance, removing some roles that just don't work in containers that we aren't going to be bringing to containers. But we have to be fairly conservative with that server core image. Now again, this is an area where your feedback is going to help a lot. The more I know, hey, we got a community of people who are trying stuff out and giving us feedback on it, the more we can take some risks with it, put it out in an insider build, ask for your feedback, and then make some decisions based on that, right? But I need that base of understanding in order to move that forward. So with that, your feedback really does matter a lot. We really, really, really want to get your feedback. So please join the Insider program if you're not already. How many people are Windows Insiders? All right. How many people are going to be Windows Insiders? Oh, come on. 100%. As you find bugs, send bug reports. We really, really do look at those. We really need to know what you're seeing, what's breaking, what's not. And tell us what you need. Like, don't be afraid of telling us. Don't be afraid that, hey, we really want this or that. It may not be easy for us. It may not be something we can add today. It may not be something we can add tomorrow, but we're bringing Linux to Windows, right? Like, And what it really comes down to is your feedback is my ammo. So when it comes to getting our teams to make hard decisions, if I can walk in with a pile of feedback and say, look, here's 50 customers who are telling us this is what they need, we just got to do it, guys. That both inspires our engineering team to want to do it, and it inspires my management, my leadership to say, yeah, let's go ahead and take that risk. Right? We've got customers who want that feature, who want WSL on server. WSL on server wasn't an easy thing to necessarily do. We had to do work to bring that in. Work internally, work with our partners to bring that along. It was feedback that enabled us to do that. So join the Insider program. Try building stuff in parallel. So as you're building a new app, build it against the existing version of Server Core, build it against the new one. You don't even have to try running it. Just let us know, hey, yeah, it's building, things look good. Build it against the new Nano image. The .NET team is going to be investing a ton in .NET Standard 2.0 on top of Nano, so they're also going to be needing feedback. Right? So we got two things in parallel that are like trains just running down the tracks. We're going to need that feedback to really know what we can change and do. And then I would really advise people get started now. So we've outlined kind of how we can go from that existing app that's running on server, 2008 R2, and start bringing that over to containers, bring it over to 2016, go through Visual Studio. You can start doing all of that now, and then as these builds progress through, we're going to be dropping newer versions of it. This is only the first feature release. We've got more. We're not done. We've got another feature release planned right after that one, and another one, all up towards LTSBs in the future as well. Right?
LTSB
Long-term servicing, yeah.
branch.
So with that, please do give us an evaluation on the session. We really do look at that. It matters. I recommend all 5s or 10s or whatever the top number is. You want me to keep giving you new features? No.
Wow.
Bribery. Yeah. And then some pointers to some links. Again, all these slides are available. Docs.com/TaylorB. I push all my slide decks up before I present them. So feel free to take a look. Let us know. And then we've got time for questions. So people can go to the mics and take questions. Yeah, go.
SSH support into Windows?
SSH support. So we have the SSH server. It's an open source project. If it's ready before we get to the feature release, we're going to bring it in. It's tight. They're working on getting it to a GA, but as soon as it is, we're going to bring it in box as part of Windows Server. You can install it today, though.
So, Eric, when you plan to have support for the loopback adapter for like local hosts on Windows?
Loopback adapter local hosts. So we got the first part of that in already. So now you can actually go to the host IP address and get to the container.
Oh, okay.
We're adding the ability to say actual local host. We're trying to get that into this feature release. It looks like it's probably going to make it. The weird thing is that localhost is defined as 127.0.0.1, which goes through a really weird path in the networking stack, as opposed to going to the actual IP address, which gets picked up by the SDN stack. So there's a little bit of work that they had to do to make that, but I think it'll make it in this.
But using the public IP address should work.
Yep, that is now fixed.
Is this also on Windows 10?
It's on Windows 10 already, and it's part of the feature release.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Windows 10 actually picked it up with the creators update. So that was actually done in Redstone 2 milestone.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. The smallest Windows container base image right now is 6 or 10 gigs. I don't quite recall. Where is it at?
For Windows Server.
For Windows
Server.
Yeah, so that's the server core image.
10 gigs.
Yeah,
And
uncompressed, yeah.
The current plan is to bring that down by a gig or so.
So it's a gig or so compressed, so it'll probably end up being about 2 gigs uncompressed that we'll be able to shrink it down. We're going to keep working on it.
Okay.
That's the one that I'm the most nervous about compatibility on. It's a house of cards.
Yeah.
If I remove one role, then like 4 other roles don't work. And so we have to be fairly diligent as we remove stuff from it, but we are trying to make it smaller.
For my usage of it, that's a far cry away from where it needs to be.
How small do you need it to be?
What is it you're trying to do with it, actually?
We're looking to roll out our services hosted on top of that, and one possibility is to go and host in Linux, where the base images are considerably smaller. but that's a big lift to move our applications over. So I'm wondering what theoretically can we get the Windows base image down to, and in what timeline would it take to do that?
Yeah, I mean, so Nano's the one that we're going to get the smallest, but you're going to have some of that same lift that you're talking about with Linux on it. So Nano, our target for Nano is that the .NET Core image of that is the same size or roughly the same size as what it is on Linux, right? Like that is the North Star. We will not get there in this feature release, but we're on that path.
So is it new services? I mean, so with .NET Core 2, the whole idea is that we can actually bring much more of your capabilities that you've been running on the .NET framework on the compatible version of Windows Server into Nano.
Yeah.
And that's our goal.
We're working with existing services, and we're able to adopt a little bit of effort to moving over to this, but we want to move over to containerization, orchestration, and the less work, the better, but the current size of the Windows-based images is just far too large for us.
We're working on it. I mean,
Okay.
I guess the real question for me is what's the size breakpoint for you? Because that's a goal that I can work with our engineering team on.
Okay. Just spitballing, maybe something like 2 gigs, like pretty far away from where we are today.
2 gigs is a download size or 2 gigs on disk?
Download.
Okay, so we're actually not terribly far away. The on-disk size looks a lot bigger, and part of that is that we have this process where we basically have hard linking. So there's one file, but we have multiple copies of it, and that reports as the full size, even though it's actually on disk really taking up a smaller segment of that.
Right.
And when we unpack it, it looks bigger. So I think on download size right now, we're at like 6 gig. As we remove a couple more gig from that, that's going to make that smaller. The on-disk size will shrink too.
Okay.
But it's really useful to have that target, and we're working on it.
Yeah, the other aspect to that is when it does get unpacked, the more of that can be shared, the better. Right now, it's hard to densely pack these things onto servers if we're constrained by the hard disk size.
Right, yeah.
So that'll be very helpful. But I'm very interested in seeing where this goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would just add to that, think about Windows Server as your compatibility for your existing apps. As you're writing new apps, especially in services where the model is they're fairly small, definitely take, with Nano, that's where we're going for the small image, because that's the new realm. That's where we can really just cut and match it with what we can do with .NET Core. So take a look at .NET Core. We've released the 2.0 alpha this week. That's where we're adding about 50,000 different APIs back from what you might be used to. And so if new work, think about .NET Core and Nano, and think of .NET Framework and Windows Server for your existing apps for compatibility and bringing them forward.
All right. Thank you.
So I had 2 questions. So one is basically MSMQ support across the container is possible or not?
Sorry, which
MSMQ support.
MSMQ.
MSMQ. MSMQ will probably, shouldn't say never. MSMQ is going to be very difficult for us to bring to containers. It's a bunch of kernel APIs, and it's got a whole part of an old networking stack, like NetBIOS. So right now, it's not in our roadmap.
But is not in the roadmap also because we
not
are
at this
heavily relying on the MSMQ.
It's not currently. Now, again, this is an area where feedback's going to help prioritize that team.
Okay.
So the more feedback we get, the more I can work with that team to prioritize that work up.
So what about other messaging pipeline like RabbitMQ and other things?
RabbitMQ is perfect. No
Okay.
problem.
And then the second question, I have it on the memory map file. So is it possible across 2 containers, can I have the memory map files?
You can't currently do memory map files across the containers.
Okay.
That is something we've been looking at a little bit. My gut is that that's going to be part of the pods work that we're thinking about.
Okay.
So that'll probably going to be not in this feature release, but in subsequent ones. Again, a scenario where like really kind of specific feedback on exactly what you want to do between that would be really, really valuable, because that actually matters a bunch to
So
the development
I can
team.
provide using the user voice.
Please, yeah.
Okay.
There's actually a container subcategory on that. And if you can, the more detail you can provide about things like that.
I can provide the complete detail. And the last question is about the synchronization object. So those are supported across container like event, mutex, and other things, or
No, but those are, because those are,
kernel's object.
yeah, those are also kind of kernel primitives.
So basically, what can I can infer it, whatever the kernel objects are there, those are not supported.
Yeah. Think that it's really as much of a different machine as possible.
No, so, but the thing is, maybe you can just give a scenario, like we used to have something like, okay, when you want to do a collective shutdown of the process, we used to have the watchdog process, we used to set some event or do something, and then each process used to shut down. Like if I'm running in a VM, let's say 10 process, and I want to do a control shutdown, they used to shut down on its own by setting an event. So now if I want to shut down the containers, because now I need to shut down the container in a graceful way. So what is the mechanism from outside world I can inform, okay, now you're going into the maintenance mode and shut down.
So you could, from the outside world, you could connect back into the container and exec a command in each one.
So
to
basically
say,
then we need to execute the command in each container.
yeah, that would probably be the more normalized way to do it.
Okay, instead of the eventing or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, I just had one simple question. So when do we get to see full framework on Nano?
Full framework on Nano. I don't know that we ever will. And the reason for that is that Nano doesn't have Win32K. So we've removed the Win32K subsystem completely from Nano. And
What is it that
there's-
you're looking to do, actually?
We have a lot of customers who are looking to migrate off of, other server SKUs, and
Yeah.
basically Nano is a good story for that. And so if they're not ready to go to containers just yet, and they're running Nano today, obviously they can't port their services and applications there. So
Well, I'm trying to figure out, because I kind of inverted of the previous person on that side
yeah,
was.
I guess we want it all.
Yeah, and that's, that's kind of, putting it all in was kind of how we got to Windows Server and everything's in there.
Yeah.
And with Nano, it's trying to be very targeted. So, but what we're trying to do at the app level is make sure that .NET Core with 2, and and there's going to be more than 2, so what's missing in 2 is good feedback to get, although we're not even done with 2 yet.
Right.
So if existing apps run in Windows Server, new apps, .NET Core and Nano. But if you want to bring that code over to .NET Core, that will be good feedback to figure out what doesn't work there.
Right, what doesn't
Because otherwise, we're just going to wind up making Nano a rebranded version of Windows Server.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks. Thanks,
But
guys.
yeah, .NET Core, .NET Standard 2.0 is something like 70% of .NET full framework APIs. Now the big one is MFC. So that's the one that's hard for most people. But that's also the one that has the most Win32K dependency.
A question about environment variables. Right now, it's very hard to pass environment variables to applications running in IIS in a container. And are you working on a
It's
solution
the process
for that?
thing.
Yeah, this is the process side. So on for Nano and for .NET Standard 2.0, that's going to be much easier now because we're not using IIS anymore. We're going to be using the Kestrel web server. So it runs as a process, which is much more native to the way that containers
Right, but
think.
if I have an application which is dependent on IIS, and
Yeah,
I
if you
really
got a-
can't change it that much.
Yeah, and so if you've got an application that's dependent on IIS, full framework IIS, it's still a little tricky. We can do global environment variables now, which makes it a little easier to do. So I can set a global one, that service will pick it up. And that's my best recommendation would be to use that mechanism. The other option is to start to refactor some of those away, and instead of making them environment variables, make them volume mounts. So pick up a config file or something from a centralized configuration
Right,
repository.
so that's obviously the other option.
So this is one that we've actually seen. Today, what we recommend is to actually run a script that will copy them. So the problem is that it's the process that those environment variables get set on.
Right.
And that's not the process IIS is running in. So what you can do is run basically your entry point becomes a script that copies them over to the machine, copy the environment variables. And then you've got full access. We're actually looking at changing the IIS image to do that for you for exactly that reason.
Right, because the IIS image also has an entry point which you can't really override.
Yep. Yeah, so actually, if you give that feedback on the IIS image, that's feedback to the team who maintains that, that maybe we should make that a top-level feature for it.
Okay, thank you.
Or you can just do it. It's actually an open source Docker file.
Yeah.
So submit a PR and they'll accept it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I got a question which might sound kind of weird, so don't get me wrong on that one. I understand that you're bringing lots of Linux capabilities to Windows Server. Containers are great. But what I'm kind of missing as a Microsoft guy is Microsoft management ways. I really miss PowerShell. I really miss other things that are typical for Microsoft. So is there any plan to bring something like that to more Microsoft guys, especially the PowerShell? I would really like that one.
So, I mean, PowerShell is going to continue to be invested in. It's open source now, so we're adding more stuff to it. And we are looking at some new management frameworks for server. So more of that's going to be coming out later this summer as well. So this is actually just the first round of stuff that we're doing with server. All the developer stuff got into this. All of the other stuff we'll be talking about later this summer. So there is more frameworks coming for that as well. If there's specific things you're looking for in terms of ways to manage stuff or features, functionality, please submit them or vote them on user voice so that we could be looking at them. But we are very, very interested in more than just Linux, for sure.
All right, thanks.
I'm with you. Bash is not my native thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's,
Right,
that's
like-
the thing, yeah.
And if I could not have to learn Bash, I'd be okay with that. I could live my life that way.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Two quick questions. First one, the name pipe stuff you mentioned with the being able to do pipes to the host. Do you know when is that available in the fall release, or is that in there now? Or
It will be in the fall release
okay, so it should be in the insider builds coming.
this summer.
Okay.
Yep. It'll first start, you'll see it in client first. In fact, it might even be in half of it is in the current insider builds on client.
Okay.
The other half is not.
Okay. Okay, and just another quick question about container isolation. If I have 2 Windows Server containers, can I actually run those on a host and then have the 2 containers project as different time zones?
Hyper-V containers for sure.
Yeah.
Windows Server containers, I'd have to double check. We did some work with Win32 Time
Yeah.
to try to provide a workaround around that. I don't remember how far we got.
Okay.
But if you shoot me an email,
That
it's
was-
taylor.brown.
That sounds like try it and see if it works.
Well, yeah, or send me an email and I'll ask the engineering team too.
Okay, cool.
It's just taylor.brown at Microsoft.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah,
We should wrap up.
it's known broken. But I know Mike was working on it this week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah,
We're at time. We should,
all right.
we can,
So we'll take a couple more questions, but we're at time, so pretty quickly they're going to
we'll just wrap up. We can just stand here and let the next people come in.
Okay.